year was 1949, and the United States was settling into a post-war era of prosperity and calm. Suburbs were expanding, and families were seeking the quiet life in places like Cottage City, Maryland. However, beneath the veneer of manicured lawns and white picket fences, a darkness was brewing that would shatter the perception of safety for one ordinary family. This was not a story cooked up in a Hollywood writer's room, but a terrifying reality that unfolded within the walls of a modest brick house. It is the tale that inspired the most famous horror film of all time. Yet the true events remain far more disturbing than any special effect could ever convey. We invite you to step back into the shadows of history. The subject of this harrowing account was a 13-year-old boy referred to in church records as Roland Doe to protect his identity. Roland was known as a quiet and solitary child who preferred the company of adults to children his own age. He lived with his parents and grandmother in a close-knit household where religion and tradition held significant sway. Despite his reserved nature, Roland was deeply loved by his family and showed no signs of psychological distress or behavioral issues during his early childhood. The normalcy of his life makes the sudden onset of the inexplicable events that followed all the more jarring. It serves as a grim reminder that evil does not always choose the wicked, but often targets the innocent. Roland shared a particularly close bond with his Aunt Harriet, who was a spiritualist and frequently visited the family home in Maryland. Aunt Harriet introduced the young boy to the concept of contacting the dead and brought a Ouija board into the household as a means of entertainment. She taught Roland how to place his hands on the planchette and invite spirits to communicate through the board. While the family viewed this as harmless curiosity, it opened a doorway that many believe should have remained shut. The boy became fascinated with the sessions and spent hours attempting to converse with entities from the other side. This innocent exploration of the supernatural would soon turn into a nightmare. Tragedy struck the family when Aunt Harriet passed away suddenly in St. Louis, Missouri, leaving Roland devastated by the loss of his confidant. The boy became withdrawn and spent increasing amounts of time alone in his room, presumably trying to contact his beloved aunt using the Ouija board she had given him. It was shortly after her death that strange phenomena began to manifest inside the house in Cottage City. At first, the occurrences were subtle and easily dismissed as the settling of the house or the imagination of a grieving child. There were scratching sounds in the walls and the sound of dripping water where no pipes existed. The family tried to ignore the growing unease settling over their home. The activity escalated quickly from auditory disturbances to physical manifestations that could no longer be rationalized away by the terrified family. Pictures on the walls would shake violently or fall to the floor with no one near them, while furniture seemed to move of its own accord. The scratching noises in the walls grew louder and more rhythmic, often sounding like claws digging into the plaster from the inside. Roland told his parents that he could hear the scratching directly under his bed and inside his mattress at night. The sound was likened to the noise of a rat gnawing on wood, but searches of the room revealed absolutely nothing. The atmosphere in the house became heavy with a palpable sense of dread. The haunting focused intensely on Roland himself as the unseen force began to make physical contact with the boy. His mattress would shake violently at night, throwing him onto the floor, while his parents watched in helpless horror. Scratches began to appear on his body, forming red welts that looked as though invisible claws were raking across his skin. These marks would appear spontaneously, while his hands were visible and away from his body, ruling out self-inflicted wounds. The terrified parents watched as their son was tormented by an entity they could not see or fight. Desperate for answers and fearing for the sanity of their child, they sought help from medical professionals and psychiatrists. Doctors examined Roland thoroughly, but could find no physical or psychological cause for the distress he was enduring. Every test came back normal, and the medical community was baffled by the welts that appeared and disappeared on his skin, with science failing to provide an answer. The family turned to their Lutheran pastor, Reverend Luther Miles Schulz, for spiritual guidance. Schulz was a skeptic by nature and decided to observe the boy overnight to prove that there was a rational explanation. What he witnessed that night in the guest room of the family home shattered his skepticism and convinced him that something truly evil was at work. He watched as a heavy armchair moved across the room on its own. Reverend Schulz knew that the situation was beyond his capability to handle within the Lutheran tradition, and made a bold recommendation. He advised the family to seek the assistance of a Catholic priest, as the Catholic Church had a more established rite for dealing with demonic possession. This was a difficult decision for a Protestant family, but their desperation outweighed their sectarian differences. They reached out to the local Catholic parish, hoping that the ancient rituals of Rome could save their son from the tormentor. This marked the beginning of a grueling journey that would take them from Maryland to the Midwest in search of deliverance. The church agreed to investigate the case cautiously. The family decided to travel to St. Louis, Missouri, to stay with relatives, hoping that leaving the house in Maryland would leave the spirits behind. They were gravely mistaken, as the entity seemed attached to Roland rather than the location. Upon arriving in St. Louis, the phenomena intensified with even greater violence and frequency. The boy began to exhibit bizarre behavior, entering trance-like states and speaking in a guttural voice that did not belong to him. objects in the relative's home began to fly across the room, including a heavy vase that shattered against the wall near the boy's head. It became clear that the evil had followed them across the country. In St. Louis, the family connected with Father William Bowdern and Father Raymond Bishop, who were Jesuits teaching at St. Louis University. Father Bishop began to keep a detailed diary of the events, a document that would later become the primary source for the true story. The priests visited the home and witnessed the shaking bed and the flying objects firsthand, confirming the reports they had heard. They saw deep scratches form words on the boy's chest, including the word hell written in red welts. Convinced that this was a case of genuine possession, Father Bowdern petitioned the Archbishop for permission to perform the major exorcism. The permission was granted with the strict instruction that it be kept secret. The exorcism began in March of 1949 and would continue for weeks, becoming a brutal battle of wills. The priests utilized the Ritual Romanum, a text dating back centuries that outlines the prayers and commands used to expel demons. During the rituals, Roland would react violently to the holy water, and the prayers often spitting at the priests with unnatural accuracy. He would writhe on the bed, requiring multiple grown men to hold him down, as his strength seemed to surpass that of a young boy. The room would become freezing cold, even though the heating was turned up high, a phenomenon the witnesses could not explain. The battle was not just spiritual, but intensely physical. Father Bowdern and his assistants worked tirelessly night after night, often going without sleep, as they fought for the soul of the boy. The entity inside Roland taunted the priests, revealing personal details about their lives that the boy could not possibly have known. It spoke in Latin, a language Roland had never studied, and mocked the prayers being recited. The psychological toll on the priests was immense, as they faced an intelligence that seemed ancient and purely malicious. They were not just fighting a mental illness, but a force that actively sought to destroy their faith and their resolve. The air in the room was thick, with a stench described as rotting meat and sulfur. The exorcism was moved to various locations, including the rectory of the college church, and later to the Alexian Brothers Hospital. At the rectory, the boy broke free from his restraints and used a bedspring to slash the arm of Father Bowdern. The violence was escalating, and the priests feared that Roland might die from the physical strain on his body. His eyes would roll back in his head, and his face would contort into a mask of pure hatred that terrified those present. The scratches on his skin continued to spell out messages and symbols, often in response to questions asked by the priests. It was a gruesome display of supernatural power. At the Alexian Brothers Hospital, Roland was secured in a room in the psychiatric wing for his own safety and privacy. The Alexian Brothers a religious order dedicated to nursing, assisted the Jesuits in the arduous process. They took turns holding the boy down during the violent convulsions that accompanied the prayers. The hospital staff who witnessed the events were sworn to secrecy, but rumors began to spread throughout the facility. Screams of agony and demonic laughter echoed down the corridors of the 5th floor, chilling the blood of everyone who heard them. The fight had become a siege, with the priests refusing to give up ground. One of the most disturbing aspects of the possession was the way the boy would recoil from sacred objects, even when he was blindfolded or in a trance. He could distinguish between holy water and plain tap water, reacting with pain only to the blessed liquid. He would scream in agony when a relic of a saint was touched to his skin, as if it were a branding iron. This physical aversion to the sacred was seen as definitive proof of the demonic nature of his affliction. The priests utilized relics of Saint Peter and the true cross, hoping to weaken the hold of the entity. The entity responded with vile obscenities and blasphemies. The days turned into weeks, and the physical condition of Roland began to deteriorate rapidly from the constant strain. He was unable to eat or sleep properly, and his body was covered in bruises and lacerations from the nightly struggles. The priests were also exhausted and pushed to the brink of their endurance, but they knew they could not stop. They understood that stopping the exorcism prematurely could result in the permanent loss of the boy's soul, or even his death. They relied on prayer and fasting to maintain their strength against an enemy that never seemed to tire. The entire team was locked in a desperate struggle for survival. As the Holy Week of Easter approached, the intensity of the manifestations reached a fever pitch inside the hospital room. The entity seemed to know that the holiest days of the Christian calendar were nearing, and fought back with renewed fury. The bed shook so violently that it had to be bolted to the floor, and the boy broke through heavy leather straps. The voice emerging from Roland claimed to be the devil himself, and boasted that he would never leave the boy. The priests redoubled their efforts, reciting the prayers of the exorcism for hours on end without pause. The room felt charged with a static electricity that made the hair on their arms stand up. On the night of Easter Monday, the final confrontation took place within the walls of the Alexian Brothers Hospital. Father Bodern demanded that the demon reveal its name and depart from the child in the name of God. The boy went into a violent seizure and shouted that he was legion, indicating many demons were present. The priests called upon Saint Michael the Archangel, the warrior saint who cast Lucifer out of heaven, to intercede. It was a moment of absolute chaos and terror, as the forces of good and evil clashed over the body of the innocent child. The witnesses in the room prayed fervently, fearing the worst. Suddenly, amidst the screaming and the thrashing, a new voice was heard from the lips of the boy. It was a clear and calm voice, completely different from the guttural growls of the demon. The boy cried out that he saw Saint Michael standing in the room, holding a flaming sword. He described a beautiful vision of light that was pushing back the darkness that had consumed him for months. At that moment, a loud sound like a thunderclap or a gunshot rang out through the hospital wing. The tension in the room snapped, and the body of the boy went completely limp on the bed. The violent shaking stopped instantly. Roland lay still on the bed, breathing heavily, but peacefully for the first time in what felt like an eternity. He opened his eyes and looked at the priests with confusion, having no memory of the horrors that had just transpired. He asked where he was and why he was restrained, seemingly unaware of the battle that had been waged for his soul. The scratches on his body had faded significantly, and the feeling of oppression in the room had lifted completely. The priests wept with relief, knowing that the ordeal was finally over. The demon had been driven out, and the boy was free. Following the successful exorcism, the Jesuits and the family agreed that the events must remain a strict secret. They wanted Roland to have a chance at a normal life without the stigma of being the boy who was possessed by the devil. Roland returned to Maryland and grew up to live a completely ordinary life, marrying and having children of his own. He never spoke publicly about what happened to him and avoided all media attention, even after the movie became a global phenomenon. The true identity of Roland Doe was protected for decades, allowing him to fade into anonymity. His silence only added to the mystery. The diary kept by Father Bishop was sealed in the archives of the Jesuit order, intended to be kept from the public eye. However, years later, the story leaked to the press and caught the attention of an author named William Peter Blatty. Blatty was a student at Georgetown University when he heard rumors of the exorcism and became obsessed with the case. He used the fragmented details he could gather to write his best-selling novel, The Exorcist, changing names and locations to protect the innocent, while the movie added green vomit and spinning heads. The core of the story was based on the terrifying reality. The room in the Alexian Brothers Hospital, where the final exorcism took place, was boarded up and sealed off for many years. Staff members were afraid to go near that section of the wing, claiming they still felt a cold presence lingering there. Eventually, the entire wing was demolished and replaced with a modern facility, erasing the physical location of the battle. However, the legend of what happened in that room persists in St. Louis folklore to this day. It remains a site of fascination for paranormal investigators and historians alike. The hospital has since been torn down, but the ground remains charged with history. Skeptics have analyzed the case over the decades, proposing theories of mental illness or elaborate pranks by a troubled teenager. They argue that the moving furniture and scratching sounds could have been faked by a clever boy seeking attention. However, the witnesses to the events included doctors, nurses, and priests, who were all educated and rational people. They risked their reputations to attest to the impossible things they saw and heard during those dark months. The sheer number of credible witnesses makes it difficult to dismiss the entire case as mere fabrication. Something profound and unexplainable happened to Roland Doe. The story of Roland Doe serves as a reminder that there are forces in this world that science cannot fully explain or quantify. It challenges our understanding of reality and forces us to confront the possibility of spiritual warfare, whether one believes in demons or not. The suffering endured by that young boy and his family was undeniably real. The fear that gripped the community and the dedication of the priests who fought to save him are matters of historical record. It is a narrative that continues to haunt the collective consciousness of the American public. The boundary between the natural and supernatural is thinner than we think. The house in Cottage City, Maryland, where the trouble began, still stands today, occupied by people who may not know its history. It looks like any other house on the street, hiding its dark past behind a facade of suburban normalcy. There are rumors of cold spots and strange noises reported by subsequent owners, though nothing as violent as what Roland experienced. It stands as a silent monument to the terrifying events of 1949. Passers-by would never guess that the inspiration for the ultimate horror story originated within those walls. The mundane appearance of the setting makes the story even more frightening. Father Bodern, the lead exorcist, reportedly suffered from the physical and mental toll of the exorcism for the rest of his life. He never spoke publicly about the details, adhering strictly to the promise of confidentiality he made to the Archbishop. However, those who knew him said he was a changed man after the ordeal, bearing the weight of what he had seen. He continued to serve as a priest, but the shadow of the exorcism lingered over him until his death. His unwavering faith in the face of pure evil remains a testament to his character. He was a warrior who fought a battle few could imagine. The cultural impact of the story cannot be overstated, as it revived interest in exorcism and the demonic within the Catholic Church. Before 1949, exorcisms were seen as a relic of the medieval past, rarely performed or discussed. The case of Roland Doe brought the rite back into the modern conversation, forcing the Church to address the reality of possession. It led to a surge in requests for exorcisms and a renewed theological debate about the nature of evil. The story changed the way the world looks at shadows and bumps in the night. It made the devil a tangible threat once again. While the movie The Exorcist ends with the death of the priest, the true story ended with the survival and redemption of the victim. Roland Doe went on to live a long life, passing away in 2020 at the age of 85. He died without ever cashing in on his fame or seeking the spotlight, maintaining his privacy to the very end. His ability to move past such a traumatic childhood event is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He refused to let the darkness define his life, choosing, instead, to embrace the light of normality. His silence was his final victory. Yet, despite the happy ending for Roland, the story leaves a lingering sense of dread that is hard to shake. It whispers that the safety of our homes is an illusion, and that ancient evils can invade the most modern of lives. The scratching in the walls, the shaking of the bed, and the cold spots in the room are primal fears that resonate with us all. We are left wondering if such a thing could happen again to someone else to us. The story of Roland Doe is not just a ghost story, but a warning from history. The door to the dark side, once opened, is difficult to close. As we conclude this journey into the abyss, we must remember that the true horror lies not in the special effects, but in the truth, the reality of a young boy held captive by unseen forces is far more terrifying than any fiction could ever be. It forces us to question what lies beyond the veil of our perception and what creates the shadows in the corner of the room. We leave you with the thought that perhaps not all monsters are made up, and not all nightmares end when we wake. Sleep well, and listen closely to the sounds of your house tonight.